Well, here I am, Commander Vex Tal of the Hegemony Science Council, about to witness what I can only describe as the most misguided diplomatic gesture in galactic history. The Galactic Academic Exchange Program, in all its infinite wisdom, has decided that our pristine research station Nebula's Edge needs a cultural ambassador from the backwater planet known as Earth. Yes, Earth. That mudball hanging out in the unfashionable arm of the Milky Way, where beings still use combustion engines and argue about whether their planet is actually spherical. The docking bay hums with the usual efficiency of our quantum-stabilized atmosphere processors, while I stand here with my fellow academics, us all trying very hard not to look as appalled as we feel. Professor Thax, our resident xenobiologist with 6 PhDs and cybernetic enhancement ports gleaming along his elongated skull, keeps muttering calculations under his breath. Dr. M. Nara, whose plasma-based consciousness flickers with what I can only interpret as scientific curiosity mixed with existential dread, hovers nearby in her containment field. And then there's Security Chief Brock 10, whose exoskeleton is practically vibrating with the urge to sterilize everything within a 3-kilometer radius. The transport shuttle, primitive by our standards but somehow managing to achieve faster-than-light travel without exploding, it settles onto the landing platform with all the grace of a drunken asteroid. Steam hisses from various joints that probably shouldn't be hissing, and I'm already calculating the decontamination protocols we'll need. The airlock cycles, and out steps our exchange student. Jake Morrison, according to his file, human, male, from something called Sydney, Australia. He's wearing what appears to be fabric clothing, actual fabric, not even bioengineered or molecularly enhanced, just cotton, with words printed on it that say no worries, mate in what our translation matrix assures me is meant to be encouraging. He's carrying a primitive pack on his shoulders and grinning like he's just arrived at some sort of recreational facility instead of the most advanced research station in 3 spiral arms. His hair is disheveled in a way that suggests either complete disregard for personal grooming standards or some sort of primitive styling choice. Day everyone, he calls out, and I swear half the Zephyrian delegation just fainted from shock. Their crystalline forms actually dimmed. This is going to be a very long semester of the formal reception ceremony, which we had spent 3 rotations planning according to the most refined protocols of 17 different species, but it lasted exactly 12 seconds before Jake Morrison completely demolished every social convention known to civilized space. "So this is the tour then?" he asked, completely ignoring Professor Thax's carefully prepared greeting in High Galactic, which had taken our linguistics department 6 months to perfect. Instead, Jake dropped his primitive pack right onto our polished quantum steel floor with a thud that made Dr. Fem Nara's plasma field flicker in what I could only assume was horror. Perhaps Professor Thax began, his voice carrying the measured dignity of someone who has addressed 3 galactic councils. "We should begin with the customary exchange of academic credentials and species-specific dietary requirements?" "Yeah, nah, I'm good," Jake replied, unzipping his pack. "Brought me own tucker." The smell hit us first. Security Chief Brock 10's threat detection sensors immediately went haywire, and 2 Zephyrian scholars actually evacuated their crystalline forms in panic. What emerged from Jake's bag could only be described as biological warfare in edible form. "Vegemite," Jake announced cheerfully, holding up a small dark jar like it was some sort of precious artifact. "Best stuff on Earth. Bit of an acquired taste, though." Dr. Femnara's plasma field turned a sickly green color. "Is that fermented organic matter? Yeast extract, mate? Loads of B vitamins?" The silence that followed was the kind usually reserved for moments when someone announces that the local star is about to go supernova. Next came something called Red Bull, which Jake claimed gave him wings, though our bioscanners detected no aerodynamic modifications to his anatomy. Professor Thax actually fainted when Jake explained it was a stimulant beverage that humans consumed voluntarily for pleasure. But the real horror came when he produced what he called Tim Tams. Chocolate biscuits, he explained to our increasingly traumatized delegation. You bite the corners off, stick it in your coffee, suck the coffee through like a straw, then eat the whole thing before it collapses. Security Chief Brock 10 was now openly calculating the structural integrity of food items being used as beverage consumption apparatus. Fascinating, Professor Keel Thax managed, his voice box clearly struggling. And these Tim Tams, they serve a nutritional purpose in your primitive society? Nah, they're just good. The concept of consuming something purely for enjoyment rather than optimal nutrient delivery seemed to break something fundamental in our guests' understanding of rational behavior. Now then, I interrupted, desperate to restore some semblance of academic dignity. Perhaps we should explain some of our more advanced systems. Our quantum fold communication array, for instance, operates on principles that might be challenging for your current understanding of physics. Jake nodded enthusiastically. Right-o. So how's it work then? Magic? The Keth Mori delegation collectively winced. Just as I was preparing to launch into a detailed explanation of quantum fold theory that would surely demonstrate the vast intellectual gulf between our species, the station's AI chose that precise moment to interrupt with its perfectly timed announcement. All academic participants, the AI's voice resonated through the chamber with mechanical precision. Mandatory survival simulation assessment will commence in 30 minutes. Please report to Holodeck 7 for equipment selection and briefing. Professor Keel Thax straightened his posture with obvious relief. Finally, something that would put this whole embarrassing cultural exchange into proper perspective. Ah, excellent timing, he declared, his voice carrying the confidence of someone who had survived 17 different hostile environment simulations. This should provide an excellent opportunity to demonstrate proper scientific methodology under pressure. The walk to Holodeck 7 became something of a procession, with each alien delegation discussing their preferred approaches with the kind of serious intensity usually reserved for declaring war on neighboring star systems. Dr. Femnara's plasma field brightened as she communicated with her containment suit's tactical systems. My energy-based physiology provides significant advantages in resource-poor environments, she announced. I can subsist on ambient electromagnetic radiation for up to 6 rotations. Security Chief Brock 10 was already running diagnostics on his exoskeleton's built-in survival packages. Standard protocol suggests immediate establishment of defensive perimeters, followed by systematic resource acquisition using quantum-enhanced scanning technology. The Zephyrian delegation huddled together, their crystalline forms chiming softly as they calculated probability matrices for various survival scenarios. Even their whispered conversations sounded like advanced mathematics lectures. Jake, meanwhile, was digging through his backpack again. Brilliant, he said, pulling out what could only be described as the most primitive tool I had ever witnessed. It was metallic, yes, but covered in what appeared to be rust, or possibly some form of organic deterioration. Various implements folded out of it at seemingly random angles, none of which looked particularly sophisticated. Haven't used the old Leatherman in ages. Professor Keel Thax stared at the device with the kind of horrified fascination usually reserved for studying ancient torture implements. That's your chosen survival equipment? Well, that and whatever's left in me pack, Jake replied, hefting the bag. Should be right. The equipment selection area was a marvel of galactic engineering, featuring survival gear that represented the pinnacle of technological achievement from dozens of species. Molecular food synthesizers, atmospheric processors, quantum tunneling shelter generators, and emergency terraforming kits lined the walls like exhibits in a museum of impossible science. Jake walked past all of it and headed straight for the basic materials section, where primitive elements were stored for, well, we weren't entirely sure why they were stored there. Academic curiosity, perhaps. Interesting choice, I observed, watching him examine what appeared to be ordinary metal scraps and organic compounds. May I ask your strategy? Keep it simple, mate, Jake replied with that insufferable grin. Fancy gear breaks. Basic stuff works. The simulation parameters materialized in the air before us, and I felt my confidence drain away like atmosphere through a hull breach. The scenario was brutal, even by our standards. Crash transport vessel on a Class 7 hostile world, minimal breathable atmosphere, aggressive native fauna, electromagnetic interference disrupting all advanced technology, and limited time to establish sustainable survival protocols. Professor Kuehl-Thax's cybernetic enhancements immediately began calculating resource allocation strategies. Dr. Fem Nara started adjusting her containment field for maximum efficiency. Security Chief Brock 10 activated 17 different survival subroutines. Jake stuffed his rusty multi-tool back in his pocket and cracked his knuckles. "Right then," he said cheerfully. "When do we start?" The holodeck shimmered, reality shifted, and suddenly we were standing in what could only be described as hell with a slightly better climate. The first thing that hit us was the smell. Sulfurous, acrid, with undertones of what I can only describe as rotting vegetation mixed with industrial solvents. The second thing was the immediate failure of approximately 60% of our advanced equipment. The electromagnetic interference is beyond calculated parameters, Professor Kuehl-Thax announced, his voice carrying the first hints of panic as his cybernetic enhancements flickered. "My quantum resonance analyzers are completely non-functional." Dr. Fem Nara's containment field sparked ominously. Energy drain exceeding projected consumption rates by 300%. "I'm losing cohesion faster than anticipated." Security Chief Brock 10 was frantically tapping his exoskeleton's diagnostic displays, each one showing various shades of red that couldn't possibly mean anything good. Primary systems failing. Backup systems failing. Tertiary systems also failing. The Zephyrian delegation had formed a defensive cluster, their crystalline forms dim and cracked from the hostile atmosphere. Their mathematical calculations had apparently not accounted for the reality that sometimes planets just don't care about your probability matrices. Meanwhile, Jake had wandered off. Not in a panicked, disoriented way that any sensible being would wander off when faced with imminent death on a hostile world. No, he'd wandered off in the casual manner of someone who'd just spotted something mildly interesting at a market. "Morrison," I called out, my own breathing apparatus working overtime against the toxic atmosphere. "Perhaps now would be an appropriate time to discuss survival strategies?" "Yeah, give us a tick," came his voice from behind a pile of twisted metal that had once been part of our transport simulation. "Just grabbing some building materials." Building materials. He was treating debris from a crashed spacecraft like items at a hardware store. While the rest of us stood there debating the theoretical applications of molecular cohesion in hostile environments, Jake was dragging pieces of hull plating toward a cluster of what appeared to be indigenous plant life. Primitive plant life. The kind that grows in dirt using nothing but chemistry and stubbornness. The structural integrity of random debris cannot possibly provide adequate shelter, Professor Kuehl-Thax protested, even as his own shelter generation equipment continued displaying error messages in 17 different languages. Jake looked up from where he was somehow weaving metal strips between organic branches. "Why not? Why not?" It was such a simple question that it actually broke Professor Kuehl-Thax's brain for a moment. Why not indeed? Because it wasn't scientifically optimal. Because it hadn't been calculated by advanced algorithms. Because it looked like something a primitive would do. Well, Professor Kuehl-Thax began, then stopped. His shelter generator had just caught fire. 20 minutes later, while we were still debating the theoretical applications of emergency protocols, Jake had constructed what could only be described as a functional dwelling. It wasn't pretty, and it certainly wasn't advanced, but it was keeping the toxic rain off his head while the rest of us got steadily more dissolved. "Right?" he announced, settling down inside his improvised shelter and pulling out that horrifying jar of Vegemite. "Anyone else hungry?" The sight of him calmly spreading the dark substance on what appeared to be preserved bread, while sitting in a shelter made from trash and sticks, while the rest of us slowly died of exposure and equipment failure, was possibly the most surreal moment of my existence. "You cannot seriously be consuming food at a time like this," Dr. Fem Nara managed, her plasma field now flickering dangerously. "Of course I am," Jake replied around a mouthful of what our sensors assured us was technically edible. "Can't think properly when you're hungry." basic survival stuff. Basic survival stuff. He made it sound so simple. That was when his multi-tool came out again. Within minutes, he'd somehow created fire using a combination of the tool's primitive flint striker and components from Dr. Fem Nara's malfunctioning containment unit. Actual fire, with actual flames, like some sort of primitive cave dweller. It was also providing more reliable heat and light than any of our advanced equipment. The thermal dynamics of combustion-based heating are completely inefficient compared to quantum-regulated temperature control, Professor Keelthax protested weakly, even as he edged closer to the warmth. Yeah, but it works when your quantum thing doesn't, Jake pointed out reasonably. By the time the simulation's hostile fauna began making their presence known, Jake had somehow fashioned what appeared to be functional weapons from metal scraps and organic fibers. They looked like something you'd find in a museum exhibit about primitive tool-making. They also looked disturbingly effective. So, Jake said, testing the balance of his improvised spear while something large and probably carnivorous howled in the distance, anyone else starting to think maybe all that fancy gear might be a bit of a liability. The sound of expensive equipment continuing to fail around us was our only answer. The howling grew closer, and what emerged from the toxic mist was the stuff of nightmares. A picture, if you will, something that looked like a cross between a heavily armored insectoid and a particularly aggressive geological formation, with far too many teeth and a serious attitude problem. The simulation's designers had clearly been having a bad day when they programmed this particular species. Security Chief Brock 10 immediately reached for his plasma rifle, the kind of weapon that could theoretically punch through 3 meters of reinforced battle plating. He pulled the trigger with the confidence of someone who had eliminated hostile targets across half the galaxy. Nothing happened. Well, that's not entirely accurate. Something happened. The weapon made a sad little whimpering noise, displayed an error message in ancient Kethmori script that roughly translated to have you tried turning it off and on again, and then began smoking in a way that suggested imminent explosion. Electromagnetic interference has completely compromised all directed energy weapons, Brock 10 announced, his voice carrying the kind of controlled panic that comes from realizing your primary survival strategy has just become a very expensive paperweight. Professor Keelthax was frantically adjusting his sonic disruptor, which was producing sounds that were definitely disruptive, just not to anything we particularly wanted disrupted. Dr. Fem Nara had attempted to weaponize her plasma field, which resulted in her briefly becoming very bright and then very dim like a light bulb having an existential crisis. The creature, meanwhile, was examining us with the kind of interest that suggested we looked delicious. Jake, however, was studying it with a completely different expression. Not fear, not panic, just professional curiosity. Ah, he said, hefting his improvised spear. Reminds me of a dropped bear, actually. A what? I managed to ask, despite my growing certainty that we were all about to become alien predator food. Dropped bear. Nasty little buggers back home. Well, not little, and they don't actually drop. But the hunting pattern's similar. The creature chose that moment to demonstrate its hunting pattern, which involved charging directly at us with all the subtlety of a collapsing star. Jake's response was to step sideways, not dramatically, not with some sort of advanced combat maneuver calculated by tactical computers. He just stepped sideways, like he was avoiding a puddle. The creature, committed to its charge and apparently not equipped with steering, it slammed directly into the twisted metal remains of our transport with a sound like a percussion section falling downstairs. Yeah, thought so, Jake said conversationally. Big, fast, but rubbish at turning. Same problem drop bears have. All aggression, no finesse. While the creature was still trying to figure out what had happened to its intended prey, Jake calmly walked up and introduced his improvised spear to what was presumably a vital organ. The effectiveness of his primitive weapon was both impressive and deeply disturbing. Right, he continued, examining the now deceased predator with the casual interest of someone inspecting roadkill. Reckon there'll be more of these, so we'll want to set up some sort of perimeter. Back home, when you're dealing with aggressive wildlife, you don't try to out-tech them. You just need to be smarter. Professor Kulthax stared at the fallen creature, then at his malfunctioning sonic disruptor, then at Jake's primitive spear. The cognitive dissonance was almost audible. "But your weapon is just metal and organic fibers," he protested. "It operates on purely mechanical principles. There's no quantum enhancement, no molecular sharpening, no targeting assistance." "Yeah, but it works," Jake replied, already busy setting up what appeared to be a primitive alarm system using metal scraps and some sort of tension mechanism. Sometimes simple's better. The next few hours were a masterclass in what I was beginning to suspect was called human ingenuity. Every time our advanced systems failed, which was approximately every 15 minutes, Jake produced some sort of workaround using materials that barely qualified as technology. When our atmospheric processors couldn't handle the toxic environment, Jake showed us how to breathe through improvised filters made from fabric and activated carbon from his fire. When our communication systems couldn't penetrate the electromagnetic interference, Jake set up a primitive but effective early warning system using visual and auditory signals. When more predators appeared, attracted by the sounds of expensive equipment exploding, Jake had somehow turned our immediate area into a defensive position that would have made a military engineer proud, all using what we had dismissed as primitive knowledge and basic materials. I was beginning to suspect we had made a serious error in judgment. It was Professor Kulthax who finally asked the question that had been growing in all our minds like some sort of intellectual parasite. "Morrison," he said, his voice carrying the careful tone of someone who suspects they've been made a fool of, "exactly what is your academic background?" Jake looked up from where he was reinforcing our perimeter with what appeared to be a complex system of primitive tripwires and mechanical triggers. "Oh, right. Probably should have mentioned that earlier." He wiped his hands on his fabric clothing with infuriating casualness. PhD student, University of Sydney. Double major in xenobiology and adaptive engineering, with a focus on resource-limited survival systems. The silence that followed was the kind usually reserved for moments when someone casually mentions they've just accidentally invented faster-than-light travel. PhD Dr. Femnara repeated, her plasma field flickering with what I was now recognizing as barely controlled rage. "You're a doctoral candidate." "Yeah, dissertations on technological adaptation in hostile environments." "Actually, this whole scenario's pretty much exactly what I've been studying for the past 3 years. Jake grinned with the kind of cheerful innocence that made me want to throw him into the nearest star. A bit of luck, really. Security Chief Brock 10's exoskeleton made a sound that was either recalibrating or having a nervous breakdown. Your primitive methods, they were calculated. "Well, yeah," Jake replied, as if this should have been obvious. "See, the thing about high-tech solutions is they're brilliant when they work, but they're usually designed for optimal conditions. As soon as you throw them into a genuinely hostile environment with unexpected variables, they tend to fall apart pretty quickly." He gestured at our collection of smoking, sparking, and generally non-functional equipment. Basic principles, though, they're universal. Physics works the same everywhere. If you understand the fundamentals, you can adapt to pretty much anything using whatever's available. Professor Kulthax sat down heavily on a piece of debris, looking like someone who'd just discovered that everything he thought he knew about the universe was wrong. The simulation. It was designed to test adaptability. "Got it in one," Jake confirmed. "Not about having the best gear. About being able to work with what you've got when your best gear inevitably lets you down." That was when the real revelation hit us. The scenario hadn't been designed to showcase advanced technology. It had been designed to break advanced technology, to force participants to rely on fundamental principles and creative problem-solving. And we had sent our most sophisticated academics, armed with our most advanced equipment, into a test specifically designed to prove that sophistication and advancement meant nothing without adaptability. We had been comprehensively outplayed by someone we had dismissed as primitive. So I managed to ask, though I was dreading the answer, "This Earth of yours, what kind of environment produces beings capable of this level of adaptability?" Jake's grin took on a distinctly unsettling quality. Oh, Earth's not too bad once you get used to it. I mean, sure, everything's trying to kill you, the weather's completely unpredictable, the wildlife's mostly venomous, the plants are often poisonous, and the geology's a bit unstable. Plus there's the whole thing where we've got predators that hunt in packs, natural disasters that can level entire regions, and an atmosphere that's technically corrosive to most galactic standard equipment. He paused, as if considering whether he'd missed anything important. But honestly, it's made us pretty good at dealing with unexpected problems. We call it a death world, but that's probably being a bit dramatic. The growing horror on everyone's faces suggested that maybe it wasn't being dramatic enough. Death world, Professor Thax repeated weakly. Yeah, mate. Home sweet home. The simulation ended with the cheerful chime that indicated successful completion of objectives. We materialized back in Holodeck 7, where the pristine walls and functioning technology felt almost surreal after our experience in technological hell. The debriefing was educational. Subject species demonstrates unprecedented adaptability, the AI announced with mechanical satisfaction. Human participant achieved optimal survival parameters while maintaining group cohesion and resource efficiency. Galactic standard participants achieved suboptimal performance due to over-reliance on advanced systems. The polite way of saying we had been utterly humiliated by someone armed with a rusty multi-tool and a jar of fermented yeast extract. Professor Thax was staring at Jake with the kind of expression usually reserved for discovering a new fundamental force of physics. Morrison, your species, they're all like this? Nah, I'm probably a bit more outdoorsy than most, Jake replied with that infuriating modesty. But yeah, pretty much anyone from back home could handle something like this. Basic survival skills, really. Basic survival skills. What we had just witnessed him accomplish would have been considered advanced tactical expertise by most military organizations in known space. You should come visit sometime, Jake continued, apparently oblivious to the existential crisis he was causing in every alien present. Australia's beautiful this time of year. Well, everything's trying to kill you, but that's just Tuesday for us. Really not that dangerous once you know what to watch out for. Security Chief Brock 10 made a sound that might have been laughing or crying. Not that dangerous. Course not, Jake said, digging into his pack again. Speaking of which, anyone fancy a Tim Tam? Reckon we've all earned a bit of a treat after that. The terrible thing was, none of us dared refuse. As I sat there, mechanically consuming what was apparently a chocolate biscuit from a world where everything was actively hostile to life, I reflected on the profound arrogance we had displayed. We had assumed that technological advancement equated to superiority, that sophistication meant capability, and that our refined civilization made us inherently better than those we deemed primitive. We had been catastrophically wrong. Jake Morrison, PhD candidate from the death world called Earth, had just redefined our understanding of what it meant to be an advanced species. Not through superior technology or complex theories, but through the simple, terrifying competence that came from evolving on a planet that apparently treated survival as a daily exam. So, Jake said, settling back with his Tim Tam and that insufferable grin, what's next on the academic schedule? I was very much afraid to find out.